I built this house with my own hands. Not metaphorically. I mean, I poured the foundation myself, framed the walls myself, ran the electrical myself. It was 1987. I was 34 years old, and I had just retired from 22 years with the City of Ottawa's engineering department. People thought I was crazy to retire that young. My pension was solid. I had started at 18 as a junior draftsman, worked my way up, and by the time I left, I was pulling a full defined benefit pension that would carry Margaret and me comfortably for the rest of our lives. The house was my retirement project. I bought 3.4 acres in the Ottawa Valley, about 40 minutes outside the city near Almonte, and I spent 2 years building every square foot of it myself. Margaret used to bring me coffee in a thermos and sit on an overturned bucket watching me work. She never complained about the mud or the sawdust or the fact that we were living in a rented farmhouse for nearly 2 years while I built. She just sat there with her coffee, and sometimes she would say, "It's going to be beautiful, Harold." And she was right. It was beautiful. It still is. We raised 2 children in that house. Our son, my older boy, lives out in Victoria now and calls every Sunday without fail. And then there is my younger one, my daughter, Renee. I don't want to speak badly of Renee. She is my daughter, and I love her the way a father loves a child completely, and without condition, even when that love is not returned in kind. But I need to tell you what happened. Because what happened nearly cost Margaret her life, and nearly cost us everything we spent 40 years building together. Renee met her husband, Travis, at a real estate investment seminar in Ottawa about 7 years ago. I remember the night she brought him home for dinner. He had soft hands and a very firm handshake, and he talked about property values the way some men talk about hockey constantly, and with great enthusiasm, and with the assumption that everyone in the room was equally interested. Margaret and I were polite. We always tried to be polite with Renee's choices. She had made some difficult ones over the years, and we had learned that saying too much too soon only pushed her further in the wrong direction. They were married 18 months later at a venue outside Carleton Place. We paid for the wedding, $42,000. I am not mentioning that to keep score. I am mentioning it because it becomes relevant to understanding who Travis is and how he thinks. The first time Travis suggested that Margaret and I should consider restructuring our estate was about 3 years into the marriage. We were sitting around our kitchen table after Thanksgiving dinner. My son was not there that year. He had stayed in Victoria with his family, so it was just the 4 of us. Travis had brought a bottle of Ontario Cabernet Franc, and he poured himself a 3rd glass and leaned back in his chair the way men do when they are about to say something they have been rehearsing for a while. He said the housing market in the Ottawa Valley was extraordinary right now. He said a property like ours, 3.4 acres, custom build, 40 minutes from the city was worth well over $900,000 in the current market, probably closer to $1 million if we priced it right. He said that Margaret and I were, and I remember his exact words, asset-rich but potentially cash flow vulnerable. He said that for estate planning purposes, it would be very wise to transfer the property into a family trust with Renee as the primary trustee, which would protect us from probate fees and capital gains exposure when we eventually passed. I told him I would think about it. I had already consulted my lawyer 3 months before that conversation. I want you to understand that. I had not said a word to Margaret, had not said a word to Renee, had not even hinted to my son. But I had driven to Ottawa and sat across from my lawyer, a woman I have known since she was articling in 1994, and I had told her that I had a son-in-law who was very interested in my property, and I wanted to make sure that interest never became a problem. She had drawn up an irrevocable family trust with my son and a neutral third-party trustee, a trust company, as co-trustees, with Margaret and I retaining full life interest in the property. It was registered. It was ironclad. And I had said nothing to anyone. I told Travis I would think about it. Over the next 2 years, the conversations became more frequent and less gentle. Travis had started a property development company with 2 other men, and from what I could piece together from things Renee let slip, it was not going particularly well. He had suggestions about selling and downsizing. He had suggestions about reverse mortgages. He had a contact at a brokerage who could list the property quietly, off-market, to avoid the disruption of a public sale. Each time, I listened. I nodded. I said I would think about it. I said nothing about the trust. Margaret knew something was wrong. She is a sharp woman. She taught high school mathematics for 31 years in Arn-Prior, and there is nothing wrong with her mind. She could see the pattern in Travis's visits the same way she could see a pattern in a student's answers. She asked me twice if we should be worried. I told her we were fine. She looked at me the way she has looked at me for 43 years of marriage when she suspects I know more than I am saying, and she let it go. She trusted me. That trust is the thing I am most grateful for in my life, and also the thing that cost me the most sleep over those 2 years. Last March, Renee called and said she and Travis wanted to come for a visit. They wanted to stay for the weekend. This was unusual. They normally came for day visits, but I said, of course. Come up. We would love to have you. Margaret made up the guest room and bought groceries, and I drove to the LCBO in Almonte and picked up a few bottles because Travis always liked to drink in the evening. They arrived Friday afternoon. Travis shook my hand with that firm handshake, and Renee hugged me and said, "The place looked wonderful, Dad. It always looks so wonderful." We had dinner and opened a bottle, and things were pleasant enough. Saturday was fine. We walked the property. Travis asked careful questions about the acreage and the well and the septic system, the kind of questions a man asks when he is assessing something he intends to acquire. Saturday night after dinner, Travis said he had brought some documents he wanted us to look over. He set a folder on the kitchen table. Inside were transfer of property forms, a deed of gift, a document transferring full ownership of the house and land to Renee, with a clause granting Margaret and me right of residence for life, which is not the same thing as ownership, and any lawyer will tell you so. He had also prepared a power of attorney document assigning Renee control of our financial affairs. He had a pen out before he finished explaining. I said I would need to read everything carefully before signing anything. I said this was not something I could decide at a kitchen table on a Saturday night. Travis smiled and said, Of course. Take all the time you need, Harold, but the notary he had arranged was available Monday morning, and it would really be most convenient if we could get this settled before they drove back to the city. I said I would think about it. I went to bed. I lay in the dark next to Margaret, and I listened to the house settle and creak the way it has settled and creaked for 37 years. I knew what was coming. I had known something like this was coming for a long time. That is why, 14 months earlier, I had done something I had not told anyone about. I want to tell you about the workshop. When I built this house, I built it the way I build everything, with more thought than most people expect and more preparation than most people think is necessary. The house has a full basement. At the far end of the basement, behind the utility room, there is a workshop. The workshop has a heavy wooden door with an exterior-grade lock, because I wanted to keep solvents and sharp things away from the grandchildren when they visited. Inside the workshop, behind the pegboard on the south wall, I built a second space, not large, maybe 4 feet deep, 6 feet wide. More of a deep alcove than a room. I built it in 1989 because I was young and I had watched enough news to know that a man who builds his own house in a remote area should have somewhere to keep important things safe. Over the years, I had kept a fireproof box in there. Inside the box, copies of every important document Margaret and I owned. Birth certificates, marriage certificate, wills, the deed to the property. And since 14 months ago, a copy of the irrevocable trust documents, a prepaid cell phone on a charging pad, and a handwritten note to myself with my lawyer's direct number and the non-emergency line for the OPP detachment in Almonte. I had told no one, not Margaret, not my son, not my lawyer, beyond the general fact that I kept important documents on site. It was mine. My preparation, the house I built to protect the people I loved. Sunday morning, I came downstairs early. Travis was already at the kitchen table with his coffee and his folder. He said he had been thinking, and he wanted to have a frank conversation. He said that Margaret's health, Margaret had been managing a cardiac condition for 3 years, made it all the more important to get these things settled. He said he was trying to help us. He said Renee was worried sick about our future. I said I appreciated that. He said there was one more thing. He said that he had spoken with a colleague who worked in estate law and who had advised him that if I was unwilling to sign voluntarily, there were legal mechanisms by which a family member could petition the court for guardianship of an elderly person deemed unable to manage their own affairs. He said this quietly and without raising his voice, and while looking at his coffee cup rather than at me. I understood then that we had moved past suggestion. I said I needed to go downstairs and get something from my workshop. He nodded. Renee came into the kitchen as I was heading for the basement stairs. I said good morning, and she said good morning, and she did not meet my eyes. When I got to the bottom of the basement stairs, I heard the door at the top close. Then I heard the lock turn. It is a simple push-button lock on the doorknob, the kind you can engage from either side. Travis had locked me in the basement. A few seconds later, I heard Margaret's voice upstairs asking what was happening. I could not hear Travis's response. Then I heard footsteps, and then the sound of Margaret being guided downstairs, not roughly, but firmly, and the door at the top of the stairs opened, and Margaret came down and the door locked again behind her. Margaret looked at me. I looked at her. She said, very quietly, "Harold," I said, "come with me, and please keep your voice down." I led her through the utility room to the workshop door. I unlocked it. I led her to the south wall, and I pressed the lower right corner of the pegboard, the way I had practiced doing alone on a dozen quiet evenings over the past 14 months, and the panel released. I showed her the alcove. I showed her the fireproof box and the cell phone on its charging pad, and I picked up the phone and showed her that it had full battery and 2 bars of signal even down there, because I had checked the signal before I chose that spot, and I had chosen it specifically for that reason. Margaret stared at all of it. Then she looked at me. She said, "How long?" I said, "Long enough." She sat down on the wooden stool I had left there, and she pressed her hands flat on her knees the way she does when she is steadying herself, and she breathed. I dialed 911. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. I told her my name and my address, and I said that my wife and I had been locked in our basement by our son-in-law, and that my wife had a cardiac condition and required access to her medication, which was in the kitchen, upstairs. The dispatcher said units were on their way and told me to stay on the line. I kept the phone to my ear. I opened the fireproof box. I handed Margaret the copy of the trust documents, and I showed her the relevant pages, the ones that made any transfer of the property null and void without the consent of the co-trustees, neither of whom was Travis or Renee. She read them in the light from the workshop overhead bulb. She read them carefully, the way she always reads everything, and then she looked up at me and she said, in her teacher voice, the one that means she has understood something completely and permanently, "He has nothing." I said, "He never had anything." We heard the OPP cruiser on the gravel drive about 19 minutes later. We heard voices upstairs. We heard Travis's voice getting louder and then less loud. We heard the basement door unlock, and a female officer came down the stairs and said, "Mr. Kowalski? Mrs. Kowalski? Are you both all right?" We were all right. Travis was charged that afternoon. Forcible confinement under Section 279 of the Criminal Code of Canada. My lawyer was in Ottawa, but she had a colleague in Renfrew County who was at the OPP detachment within 90 minutes. The colleague reviewed the property transfer documents Travis had prepared and confirmed what I already knew, that the property was held in an irrevocable trust and had been for over a year, that Travis's documents were worthless, and that his preparation of those documents combined with the confinement created a very clear picture of intent to commit fraud. Renee was in the kitchen when the officer brought Margaret upstairs. Renee was sitting at my kitchen table with her hands in her lap, and she was crying. Not the crying of someone who has been caught and is afraid of consequences. The crying of someone who had told herself a story about what she was doing, and the story had just collapsed. "I know my daughter. I know the difference." The officer asked if I wanted to press charges against Renee as well. I thought about it. I thought about the woman sitting at my kitchen table, who I had driven to hockey practice at 6 in the morning for 11 winters, who I had helped move into 4 different apartments, whose wedding I had paid $42,000 for. I thought about what a criminal record would do to her life. I told the officer that Renee had not physically locked the door. I said I would leave that for the Crown to assess. Travis was taken to the detachment in Arnprior. He was released on bail 2 days later with conditions that included no contact with Margaret or me. Renee called me the following Thursday from her mother's phone. I had blocked her number, not out of anger but out of necessity while the matter was before the courts. She cried for the first few minutes. Then she said she was sorry. Then she said Travis had told her it was all legal, that he had done research, that we would be protected. Then she said she did not know he was going to lock the door. I said I believed the last part. She asked if she could come and see me. I said not yet. I want to be very clear about one thing. I did not build that hidden space because I distrusted my daughter. I built it because I have been a structural engineer, and I have lived long enough to know that a man who builds a house is responsible for the safety of everyone inside it, and that safety sometimes means preparing for failure modes that you hope never occur. I built that space the same way I installed a backup generator and kept 3 months of medication in the house and made sure the propane tank was always at least half full before a winter storm. Not because I expected disaster, because I respected it. Margaret had a cardiology appointment the week after. Her doctor said her numbers were stable. He did not know what had happened, and she did not tell him. On the drive home, she reached over and put her hand on mine on the gear shift the way she has done since 1981 when we were dating, and I drove a rusted Civic that barely made it through Ottawa winters. She said, "You didn't tell me because you didn't want me to worry." I said that was part of it. She said, "The other part was that you wanted me to be able to say honestly that I didn't know, if anyone ever asked." I said that was also part of it. She nodded. She looked out the window at the fields along Highway 29, the gray March fields with the last of the snow still in the low spots. And she said, "I always knew you were more stubborn than you let on, Harold." I said I had learned from her. Travis's case is proceeding through the Ontario Court of Justice. My lawyer tells me the Crown is taking it seriously. The fraud component, the preparation of documents designed to unlawfully transfer property held in trust, adds weight to the confinement charge. I am not a man who takes satisfaction in another person's legal trouble, but I am also a man who remembers sitting at a kitchen table while someone told me quietly and without raising his voice that he had mechanisms by which to have me declared incompetent. So when I say that I am not taking satisfaction in it, I am being almost entirely truthful. My son flew in from Victoria 2 weeks after everything happened. He sat at my kitchen table and listened to the whole story, and then he sat quietly for a moment, and then he said, "Dad, when did you build the hidden space?" I told him. He said, "And you never told anyone?" I said no. He shook his head slowly, and he looked at the table, and then he looked at me, and he said, "You are the most quietly terrifying man I have ever known." And then we both laughed, which was the first time I had laughed properly in a month, and it felt like something releasing. The property is still in the trust. It will go to both my children equally, or to my grandchildren if they predecease me. That is what the trust says, and that is what will happen. I did not change that after everything that happened. The trust is not a punishment. It is a plan. Renee has not come to the house yet. I think she will eventually when she is ready to talk rather than explain. I am her father. I will be here. The house is very quiet in the evenings now. Margaret plays bridge online on Thursday nights, and I usually read or watch the game, and sometimes I go down to the workshop, and I check the fireproof box, and I check that the prepaid phone is still charged, and I leave everything exactly as it is. Not because I expect anything more to happen, but because the workshop is mine, and everything in it is something I built or placed there with intention, and I like to be reminded of that. I built this house with my own hands. 37 years ago, I poured this foundation, and I framed these walls, and I thought about what a house is supposed to do for the people inside it, which is keep them safe, not just from the cold, from whatever comes. That is still what it does.